Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa. I'm one of the founders and co-CEOs of Dig Ventures, and it is my very, very great pleasure to be with you today to discuss the fantastic Neolithic stone tool finds from our site in Ireland. So this is also the first online live event of 2026, which is quite timely, especially in the wake of St. Patrick's Day earlier this week. So for many of you, when you hear the words Neolithic Ireland, your mind probably goes straight to towering monuments and tombs the size of, football fields, gigantic structures. But archaeology is not just about the monumental. And sometimes the most revealing and important stories come from tiny fragments of objects small enough to fit on your fingertip. So Dig Ventures have been digging in the Boyne Valley since 2023, and we found some incredible evidence of the Neolithic monument makers during our time there. From evidence such as burned items, burned pottery in our trenches, to the remains of these gigantic monuments themselves. But today we're here to focus on a type of find that became hugely significant to part of our work in 2025 and introduced me personally to the word triboluminescence or triboluminescence. I'm still not sure how to say it, but it's a really big deal for me now. And today we're very lucky to be joined by Cian Hogan, who is a geophysical archaeologist and lithic specialist and our specialist on the dig, and also by, of course, Brendan. Welcome, Cian, and also by Dr. Brendan Wilkins, the DV founder and co-CEO, and the licensed director who's running the site in Ireland. So thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today. And as we delve into the world of Neolithic stone tools and explore what we learn about the people of Neolithic Ireland from their tools, I thought it would be really useful if Brendan took a moment before our Neolithic Toolbox talk to tell us a little bit more about the site and its context, what is going on in this time and place that sets the scene for these tools, because we all know that context is everything. So tell us more, Brendan.
Context is absolutely everything. Goodness me. So it's such a wild and expansive site and landscape and project. It's so difficult to know where to begin. But our project is licensed by the National Monument Service for a 5-year project. Each year we have to submit reports and reapply for our license. But after that, then there's 2 years of analysis. But at the end of each year, we write up our finds, we publish our reports, and through that we create new research questions that we take into the field next year. So it's this kind of iterative process. So we're focusing on, I guess, a landscape level analysis. That is the Boyne Valley Research Project. And what we're particularly interested in is the southern buffer to the World Heritage Site. So the World Heritage Site comprises the bend in the Boyne and the very famous passage tombs of Knowth, Dowth and Newgrange, the highest concentration of Neolithic rock art anywhere in Europe. And these really monumental, significant tombs are flowering of the Middle Neolithic. But what we're really interested in is what came before. What was there perhaps in the early Neolithic? What was there perhaps in the late Mesolithic? Were these tombs laid out in this kind of blank canvas? Or was there actually a story before, if you like, a prequel to the box set of the Boyne Valley? But also we were interested in what happened after the Middle Neolithic into the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. So it's really about the change, the massive changes that took place in that landscape. And we've done that by effectively zooming out of the landscape to look at satellite imagery, to look at LiDAR, and to look at near surface geophysics on a landscape level scale, and then zoom back in and do tiny keyhole excavations in very, very specific places. And really today, with Cian here, we're zooming in even further to look at a very small type of artifact type, our lithic material, and what that can tell us about this unfolding story.
Excellent. Well, we're going to stay zoomed out, or zoomed in, I should say. We're going to focus on these tools for a little bit in the beginning before we start talking about the site in the wider context. So, Cian, I'm going to start by asking you a question that we get asked literally every time we find any kind of stone tool on site. So, when you first pick up a piece of struck flint before any formal analysis, what are you actually looking for? What does a worked stone really tell you in the first sort of 30 seconds of looking at it?
Thanks very much for having me. So, for archaeologists, when we're identifying a piece of work stone, we're looking at either the two faces of it. We're looking on one face to see if there's any previous signs of previous removals that are either possibly organized, so parallel ridges. And then on the reverse face, we're looking for um, a couple of features, either a bulb of percussion, which is a slight rounding or bump at the top. It's not always present. So this will indicate that it's been struck at a particular angle with a hammerstone. And then I think in the diagram there, you also see ripples, which are also called waves of percussion. So again, these will tell us the direction of the strike has come from. We might also look for little removals near the top of the flake or blade to tell us that somebody has taken the time to prepare that edge for striking, so that there's an intention behind it. These kind of characteristics would be very much just the result of human-made objects in the ground. It does become this. This would be a kind of knapping known as either freehand or direct percussion. Also indirect percussion, where you can see in the photo there, somebody may hold a piece of stone on their knee or in their hand, and then in their other hand they'll have either a hammerstone, so another piece of rounded stone, a cobble or a nodule, or in this case in the photo they appear to have a wooden billet, or another tool for striking. Sometimes this could be a piece of antler, depending on where you are in the world. And basically the flint or chert or whatever stone they happen to be working at the time is then struck at particular angles to remove little flakes, as you can see there, the dark grey one. So generally, when we're left with material, we have two pieces. We have the core, which is what removals, either flakes or blades, are taken from. These are often discarded at the end of the process, so we can see what could be a significant lump of flint with multiple scars on it. Sometimes around the entire object, sometimes just on one face. So that would be one part of what we're looking for. These can be difficult to identify, especially depending on your background soils. A lot of the stones that are worked by humans can be transported to areas by glaciers or rivers, and you can end up with objects that look very similar. So again, going back to what Brendan was saying about context, where we get, kind of features within the soil, if objects are retrieved from them, we can be more confident in our analysis. Where they're retrieved from topsoil, we need to be much more cautious in terms of our interpretation, that we're factoring in different elements, either trampling by humans or later machinery, that can create kind of false cores, false flakes, false blades, that appear very similar to archaeological artifacts. So you're looking at a range of kind of.
I was
Yep,
just going to say,
go
as
on.
a field archaeologist who's not a specialist, the features that I often see that are most helpful are the little nibbling along the edges that you said, that shows that it's been deliberately shaped. And the bulb of percussion is always really helpful to have as well. And we
Hmm.
did have several finds actually from the site in the Boyne. Brendan, you'll remember that were clearly washout finds. So they've been washed from topsoil somewhere. So it's so important, really, I think, to find them within the features, as we were also lucky enough to do last year. And they're so fresh, it's incredible. Some of them are still so sharp. It feels like you could pick them up and use them today. Do you have any recollection, Brendan, of some of the fresher ones that we found in the features last year?
Sure. So we can see that they're not just being transported, because of course these didn't often emerge here. They're either transported, as Kim was saying, in the very distant past by glaciers, and that's natural background material, or they're actually brought by people from sources of good quality flint that may have been exchanged or carried to the site. We do see instances in our site and on our landscape of actual flint napping on site. And I wonder, Cian, as you know, we find these things, everyone jumps to joy, puts them in a bag and sends them off to you. But when you look at it as a totality, do you see any instances of workmanship within there? Are there some that are more poorly, or maybe people not quite as good, and some where you go, wow, this person really knew what they were doing?
Certainly, when it comes to kind of modified forms, so when you're talking about kind of very finely worked objects like arrowheads, or you'll get some knives, knife-like forms as well, or sometimes you'll go down to, say, polished materials that are or objects that have been polished. So you can see a range of degrees of working through the stone material, and that's something you can see at Denor. So we do have just some of the standard cores. So you also have some split pebbles where they've taken a nodule and just split it in half or into quarters, and these would be very quick ways of working stone. So they're looking for something kind of very quick and expedient to use. Yeah. You also have just a range of kind of flakes and blades that are unmodified, so you just have that initial removal. Sometimes these can be part of a preparation stage for a more formal style of artifact, and other times this is all that the individual wanted at that time. Some of those unworked or unmodified flakes and blades can be used quite effectively once that edge is sharp. So if they just needed some sharp edge for peeling either a branch or something else, they could be using that as it is. But then when we move on to kind of those more eye-catching artifacts, the ones that everybody can kind of spot, you know, in the ground without difficulty, those arrowheads. As I said, sometimes you've mentioned the disc beads and stuff in other presentations, or the axe heads. Like, these take on a stage and a degree of working where you can see that the person is planning exactly what they're going to take off in terms of small little removals, or how they need to kind of do a preliminary shape of an object before doing a final finish, as with the polished stone axe head. So you do see a range of abilities within those assemblages.
That was going to be one of my next questions, because there is a real skill involved with napping. It's not just an easy one-stop shop type of process, and it really does depend on the quality and the sort of internal characteristics of the material that that you're working with. I've been lucky enough to see James Dilley, Phil Harding, Will Lord and his father, John Lord, you know, working flint at various different times in my career. And it is incredible. And I mean, James always wears safety glasses, because, you know, when you're striking and a piece of debitage can fly off, and they're really sharp. And so it is interesting hearing from you as an expert about what the quality of the working in an assemblage also tells us, as much as the assemblage itself, you know.
Yeah, there is. It's as kind of archaeologists, and you've mentioned a few individuals there who do incredible reconstructions or replicas. And what we, you know, I don't do any napping myself, so I'm looking at those lithics from a very different perspective. You know, it is from a kind of landscape information level, and those individuals are the other side of the coin. So when you do talk to people about how they work stone, how they nap it, how they produce these, you learn an awful lot, and you do see the kind of considerations that are involved. You know, and it also changes as those individuals kind of practice more and more. We change our understandings and opinions of stoneworking. So the photo that was just up there is a form of lithic reduction known as bipolar napping. So this is where they put the core on an anvil stone and they strike it from above with the hammer stone. And for a long time, this was perceived as a kind of deterioration in knapping abilities, or it was unskilled compared to some of the other work. So it was overlooked in terms of lithic research by archaeologists for many decades. It's only in the last 2 or 3 that there's been an increasing focus, and this is showing us that there's actually an incredible level of skill within that work, and it can produce functional tools very quickly, rather than the kind of freehand form. So where you hold a core can involve quite a bit of preparation to get what you want, whereas with that bipolar version you can very quickly produce tools. There's a researcher in UCD, Brendan Dumoulin, who his master's thesis was on bipolar reduction, so he has spent a lot of time practicing this developing his skill at bipolar reduction, and he's gotten it to the stage where he can nearly peel the outside layer of flint off, kind of like an orange. He can take that outer skin off nearly completely. So it's a very, when we see the applications of when we start delving into these, we can kind of pick out the nuances and understand the levels of skill and identify them much easier or better within the archaeological record.
And at the site that we're working on in Ireland, it's very exciting because there's a piece of pottery that's been found from our side of the river and a piece of pottery that's been found from the other side of the river that have the same stamp on the bottom. So, there's been some talk about, are we looking at the same potter, for example? And I admit I've been wondering on the site, as we're finding these tools and other things that are maybe tools or maybe not tools made in different materials, would there have been one napper on site? Would it have been a distributed thing? Could we see signatures, for example, of individuals who make things in a certain way? And we've been talking, basically so far around stone tools as functional objects, scrapers, blades, axe heads, arrowheads. But is that the only frame, really? Certainly on the site in Denor, there are pieces that seem to have been made for reasons that aren't purely practical. So can you talk a little bit about that? Is that the same process when they're making something that might not be necessarily for daily use? What do you see as an expert?
I think with those kind of artifacts that you see in, say, more ritual kind of contexts, or do not appear as kind of everyday or functional, you generally see a higher level of skill applied within them. So within, say, the Boyne Valley context, something like the Mouth Mace Head, it's on flint, so the exact same as any of those other objects that are coming from the site, but the level of skill applied in the manufacture or the making of that object is far greater. So there is a greater level of attention and detail put into those objects that are more ceremonial in nature, or appear to be certainly more kind of ceremonial in nature. Until it's challenging. We don't always end up with the full range of material from the manufacture of these pieces. Some of them can be quite small and so are easily missed, and so in terms of how and where they were making these tools, we often end up with the finished form, but we're not sure if are they manufacturing them right in that place, are they maybe coming from a workshop or a knapping floor somewhere else. You'd see that with some of the discussions around the polished stone axe heads. The kind of main, or one of the principal views would be that for a lot of stone axe heads, they maybe came, certainly porcelainite ones would have come from very specific knapping floors or workshops up north, and were then redistributed either as a rough out or a finished form across the rest of the country. So we do see a kind of it's a little bit more challenging to pick out those kind of ceremonial ones when you're looking at kind of individual sites.
So let's move on from talking about the stone tools in general to talking a little bit more specifically about our site in Ireland. So I'm going to start actually with asking you both the same question, which is, When you first looked at what we recovered from Denor, from the site, what stood out to you, and what made you think from the assemblage that this site had something genuinely interesting to say? So I'd love to hear from Brendan first as the site director for the site, and then I'd also love to hear your technical opinion as well, Kian. So Brendan, what stood out for you around this assemblage?
So this is it's an infinitely interesting site. There's not a single thing that doesn't surprise you. I mean, from the very first moment that we put a shovel in the ground, that's why it's a World Heritage Site. That's why it's a buffer zone to a World Heritage Site. But I think what really struck me, and this is kind of coming through some of the discussion here about stone tool types and how archaeologists think about things. Well, there's an element of bias in how archaeologists kind of sometimes have to deal with their evidence. We have to put them into certain categories and certain orders so that we can communicate with each other. But that sometimes forms a barrier between us and the people of the past. And here in this discussion, we've been talking about craftsmanship and how people learned this and whether you can see people in their own styles. And I think that's really where archaeologists should be thinking. But often the way we do archaeology stops us. So what I was very surprised about was how years and decades of fantastic work by the giants of archaeology whose on the shoulders we stand, very much focused on one area of this very complicated, joined up landscape, the central bit, the bend in the Boyne, when really if you kind of take a step out and to a higher level, you can see that there's actually much more going on. And whilst the central bit was super important within a very specific period of time, you know, as you move south of the river, that actually was potentially the area of importance. So it's about changing the perspective, brings a whole range of new evidence and new information and new knowledge to light. And I think that's what struck me most, that archaeology is this continuous process of discovering new things. Archaeology is never done. And so everything surprises me about the site. Over to you, Kian.
I think there's a couple of standout artifacts which are certainly very surprising and rare, you know, that show the importance of the site at Denor. So one of those would be the little disc, the perforated disc bead. These are, so I think it's as I'm looking at it, it's the second from the right there anyway. So these are a rare kind of form of bead. They wouldn't appear too often, but they show again a range of working tools. So these would have been kind of ground smooth for their final thing, and then you also would have had that central hole would have been perforated with a borer. So again, it shows a range of abilities applied by knappers to their final product. We can also kind of infer that, you know, they have a range of tools within their kit, you know, so they must have a grinding platform, they must have either a flint or maybe a piece of wood to punch through that central perforation. And then it shows us connections as well to other sites around, other Neolithic sites around Ireland. So I think there's a very similar bead, I think, recovered from Newgrange, from the main monument at Newgrange, or certainly in the vicinity. And then very interesting, you had a site excavated as part of the M50 in Dublin a few decades ago, where they found a series of 9 similar beads on a little shelf in a pit, which was dated to the Middle Neolithic. So that's kind of tying in again with that greater, you know, that broader Neolithic landscape around. It also offers us a little insight into the people of the time. So these would have been objects for personal kind of adornment, so that, you know, at that time we can say that, oh, they were wearing pendants, necklaces, you know, we can kind of find, you know, we can kind of picture them a little bit better in terms of how they would have presented themselves to others in society at that time. I think another standout kind of one would be the barbed and tanged arrowhead. So this is slightly later than the Neolithic. These particular forms would date to the Chalcolithic, so from about 2500 to 2000. But again, it shows us the kind of movement of a material or movement of a people and a culture into the area that very different to what came before it in terms of its weaponry. So very different style of arrowhead, a new style coming in. And then also with that one, because its tip is broken, we get to see some of these objects actually being used, so we can, from that broken tip, we can infer that this was damaged through use. So somebody was out hunting and actively looking for either their next food or something for sport. We don't, so there's a couple of things like that certainly, it's a wonderful assemblage.
Can I ask you, Cian, how can you tell that the break on that arrowhead, for example, was made through use by someone hunting and perhaps there was a deer wandering off with a little bit of it stuck in his shoulder blade, rather than one of our shovels?
So you're looking at condition. So if over time, let's say if that arrowhead is found in the topsoil of a site, over time it'll be moved around and the edges, instead of being sharp, become abraded, so they get a little bit smoother, less sharp. If that break was something more recent, then the edge that's along the break would be much fresher, so you'd feel a difference as your fingers going around it. Also the types of breaks, so when you're looking at kind of the little scars or how that break is formed, there is differences between, say, something that's impacted and sheared off, or something that's been stepped on and snapped off. So there is a few differences. It is difficult, it is challenging, but there are a couple of little measures that you can kind of use to say either the condition or the form of the break that says, okay, this is possibly broken during, or more likely broken during use, or this was broken when somebody hit it with their trowel or something like that. So there is a couple of things like that that'll tell you whether a break is more recent or occurred in antiquity.
And in terms of the bead, which I was actually on site the day that bead was found, and our venture working in the trench had literally sieved every single, it was an entire wheelbarrow of soil from the bottom of one of our ditches. So very compacted. I think it was basically clay. It was a really hot day, and to her great credit, she just kept going, and it was the last sort of hand sieve full of soil that this bead came out. Incredibly fine work that she did. Just wondering, what would be what would the tool that was used to do the boring in the center of a bead like that? What would that tool have been made out of? Oh, Cian, we've lost volume.
Yeah.
How about now?
There we go. Yep.
Yep. So you would have a tool type within Neolithic Ireland and earlier and later periods that would be used for boring, and those would often be made of flint. So what you would have is that they would take a flake off, and then they would remove little chips at one end, sometimes on the side of it, to create a point, so that you'd have kind of like an edge, and then the point would come out, and basically they would kind of twist that through materials to either, in this case stone, but you'd also find that they could be used on leather materials or other kind of materials as well. So again, that is a tool type that we regularly find on Irish, archaeological sites. They can be a little bit difficult sometimes to identify, but certainly it's hard to, you can tell again on some of them. You can see the scars from the rotation on that point, or you can see abrasions on certain areas that tell you this has been rotated within materials. So
well, there you go. Everyone who's joining us on site this summer, you know what to look for. There's one class of lithic artifacts that we found at Denor that is very special. And so I don't feel like it would be right to just to not talk about them as a grouping. And I'm of course talking about the quartz objects. I don't know what to call them, tools or what, because we're not, at least to my knowledge, we're not sure whether or not they were ever actually used. So both Cian and Brendan, can you offer us some reflections about the quartz items that we found on site? Brendan, what's it like for you to find things like that in this place?
Well, so quartz is well known from the Boyne Valley. Famously, of course, Newgrange is constructed. The facade of it is constructed out of quartz cobbles. But this is something quite different. The artifacts that we're finding, little pebbles as well. But the artifacts that we're finding are struck rock crystal. So it's as a material that's exceptionally difficult to work. It doesn't fracture quite as easily as flint, but it's also exceptionally beautiful to look at. And the act of striking it actually creates a reaction known as triboluminescence. So it creates light as it's struck. And of course, in the Neolithic, and particularly in this location, the light has a huge symbolic relevance. Of course, Newgrange is aligned on the midwinter sunrise. So there are all kinds of things that imaginative reactions that you get when you find this material. But we found one not last year, the year before, and I thought, well, that's got to be the find of the dig, hasn't it? And lo and behold, we found multiple similar artifacts this year. And remembering what I was saying, our trenches are keyhole. They're very, very small. So we have to think that, we're looking at a keyhole through a much larger room, if you like, a site that's as big as several football pitches. So there's something very significant going on. This material is being found not just as finished artifacts, but also chips. So we have to assume also that it's being worked in this particular place. So just as Cian was talking about the movement of flint over great distances and perhaps being exchanged, this material itself is also coming over great distances. Where? We're not quite sure yet. Our project is still in play. There's more analysis to be done. But quartz of this quality has been identified right down in the Kerry Peninsula. Sometimes called Kerry diamonds. And the material itself isn't just found on the surface, it's found in very hard to reach parts of sea cliffs, sat within gaps within the Devonian sandstone. So there's lots of more work to do. This has been a hugely significant part of our project, but similar Neolithic sites, particularly in Wales, also have a huge preponderance of chipped quartz artifacts, the same kinds of type. So we know that this is a much wider early Neolithic practice that extends into Britain and beyond as well. How about you, Cian?
Yeah, from a lithic analyst's perspective, quartz you're less enthusiastic about it. It's much more of a challenge to actually understand it. It's those markers that you're looking for, those bulbs of percussion, those waves of percussion, or the platform preparation. They don't appear in the same way. They're not anyway as clear. So it is a very difficult material to analyze. There was a PhD by Killian Driscoll from UCD a number of years ago who did fantastic work in terms of napping some quartz and trying to replicate and understand. And so his research, and some by the likes of Torben Ballin in Scotland, he's looked at some Scottish quartz material that helps other analysts kind of push along understandings. So it's presenting much more challenging aspect of any analysis for us. It is incredible though that you do see same tools, scrapers or borers, kind of being produced on this material. When they had a much easier resource to work to hand. So there does seem to be a much more deliberate choice in terms of its selection. As to why, we don't know. That aspect of how it is worked, or what happens when it is worked, so when it is struck, the triboluminescence that you mentioned is certainly an interesting aspect, especially when you're in a landscape like the Boyne Valley, where there are kind of ritual associations with the activity that goes on there. So was this part of that aspect? We see quartz appearing within the Irish archaeological record in cave sites. So that electric light, when you strike two pieces of quartz together in a cave setting, that electric light would appear quite brilliant. Then again, so do you have some significance around the production or just the striking even of those pieces of quartz together to produce some effect either at night or when it's darker within a structure maybe? There's kind of ways you can kind of take an interpretation, and quartz certainly provides for some interesting ones. There's an interesting parallel, or there's an interesting from North America. Some of the kind of Native American tribes there would have made rattles out of quartz. So they would have made a very thin, hardened skin and filled that with quartz stones, and they would have shaken it. So at night you would have seen these sparks from those electric sparks from the quartz. So we do see it as a kind of ritual component within other cultures. So there's certainly possibilities. It raises similar possibilities for Irish archaeology as well, in terms of its use in that way.
And would you say, given the totality of the collection from Denor that you've examined, would you say that there's any kind of a high preponderance then of the quartz within our collection? Is there anything you can say about how much of it we've found so far that adds to what we might be able to think about for the site? Or am I just being really hopeful and asking you a massively leading question?
I think at the moment I would probably kind of hedge my bets and say, I'll wait till the excavations are finished and I get to kind of look at everything in its entirety. There are other sites around the country where we are getting significant quantities of worked quartz. There was a large Neolithic monument up Donegal or North, which I think had a huge quartz component to the assemblage. Again, I think Cage of Fields were mentioned within discussions last year, and the quartz present there. So we do have, other sites where quartz is a frequent occurrence. So again, it certainly has interesting parallels with other Neolithic sites. But at this stage, it's probably a bit early to say for Denor itself, in anticipation of more excavation and a larger assemblage and more clarity on features and stuff. Then it's probably best to wait until we have full picture in that case, I think.
Spoken like a true scientist, Cian.
Yes, I'm about to say, fair play to you. Anyone who's listening who knows me well knows that I just can't help myself. And I'm about to hit you with another question like that too, so brace. But we are very interested in what was happening on the hilltop before our earliest confirmed Neolithic features, the sort of pre-monumental landscape. And in fact, some of our trenches this year are targeted at, possibly chasing some earlier material. But is there anything in the assemblage that we found so far that might be pushing into that earlier period, kind of hinting that there might have been something before the big early Neolithic monuments we found so far?
I don't think so. You get quite a different. So moving from that. If we're going back in time from the Neolithic into the Mesolithic, you do get quite a change in terms of our lithic culture. So the later Mesolithic, we have kind of a large flake and blade technology. So they're producing flakes and blades from chert, flint, that could be 10 centimeters or so kind of large, and then they're working them in very specific ways. There hasn't really been any obvious material from that kind of assemblage that would be present in the material so far. So it's a little bit difficult to say. They do pop up at times, and sometimes in unexpected kind of places. But it's, again, you would need something very specific. You would need a very specific form of artifact, of lithic artifact, to kind of start talking about those earlier sequences. I think there's from my perspective, there would be a lot more continuity between periods, from the later Mesolithic into the Neolithic into the Bronze Age, in terms of how stone was worked, flint, chert, other stone types, then would maybe be popularly understood, or have been previously understood, that we see some of the same materials being worked. So it becomes a little bit more challenging to pick out separate periods in that sense.
Yeah.
And Brendan, from your perspective, what do you think is the likelihood? Explain a little bit about our target this year that you're sort of got fingers crossed on, and why we're hoping we might find some of that earlier activity.
Sure. I mean, that would be the buying pints for the crew moment. If we find those artifacts from the late Mesolithic or earlier, that would just completely change the picture for me. So as I said at the outset, this is to some extent the prequel to the well-known story of the Boyne Valley. But finding early material, late Mesolithic material that shows that what was going on before the Neolithic people emerged and arrived in the landscape is the prequel. And that kind of gives hints of why all this great, amazing Middle Neolithic archaeology is there. What was going on before then? And often we find natural features, persistent places, as they're sometimes called, or origin places, have this very interesting link with later Neolithic monumentality. We can see it in the Stonehenge landscape with a site called Blickmead, which was a Mesolithic and late Mesolithic site, very suggestive of what came after, a place that people kept returning to, often seasonally. And we wonder whether there are these seasonal locations within the Boyne Valley, particularly in the southern buffer zone, natural spring features, now lost paleo ponds, streams that curiously run from a colebia often, which is a hematite or orangey rust-coloured water. If we could find earlier material at those locations, that would be hugely significant. But as Cian was saying, it's very, very, very difficult. The Neolithic, we have settlements, we have houses, we have monuments, but in the Mesolithic period, people tread lightly. So that material, that Mesolithic material, often gets found in different kinds of archaeological investigations, like large-scale road schemes or big sites where huge amounts of ground is being stripped and excavated, and it's often almost found by accident. You find a concentration of lithic material. So it's a big ask. It would be an amazing story or chapter to add to the story, but I'll go with Cian's scientist approach and say let's wait and see.
Great. Well, that pretty much answers my final question. We've got some good questions stacking up in the chat that I'd like to move on to. But before we do, looking at the assemblage that we've recovered so far and what we're able to understand about the site from that, both in terms of its temporality, but also how the different areas of the site were maybe functioning in a different way and had different activities going on. What would make the assemblage complete? Like, what would be the sort of, if you could ask us to find something that would help make sense of the assemblage, what would that item be? And I feel like Brendan has just said something from the Neolithic that's definitely, or from the Mesolithic that's definitely Mesolithic. So Cian, what would you say as a lithic specialist that you'd like to see us add to the collection?
I think there was another very interesting piece which you don't see on many Irish sites, and that was a piece of pitchstone. So it was just a little fragment of, this is a kind of volcanic glass. I think its origin in terms of the British Isles is fairly confined to Scotland. So the two bits that came from the site were like a fragment that size and a tiny little chip. So it would definitely, I would be wondering, why are those two fragments there? Why is, where these must have come from a core, from a bigger piece. So for myself, it would be certainly very interesting to see, is there more material, more pitchstone material coming from Denor? It's something that is a rarity in terms of Irish assemblages, and definitely of key interest.
Cool. Well, there we go. We've got our job completely fleshed out. We know what we're looking for. And for those who are listening, when the pitchstone came up, I've never personally seen that material before, and it looks almost like obsidian, and it feels a bit like obsidian, very, very, very sharp and very light also in terms of the weight of it and the bulk of it. So, so great. I know exactly where it came up out of the trenches, and so we'll head back there next year and see if we can find your core, Cian. So I'm going to head over to some of the questions now. The first one is from someone called Irillian. I hope I'm saying that right. But do you think knapping would have been a skill people learned from childhood and the whole community would know how to do it? Or would it have been a specialist occupation back in the day?
So it probably would have been a skill that was learned from childhood. You have a few researchers who would look for evidence of children napping. This would come more from the continent rather than Irish archaeology now. So it was definitely a skill that was certainly begun to be taught from childhood. It would have been a specialist occupation. So I'd say you would have had, certainly for somebody like for the production of, say, the Nowth mace head or high quality pieces, this is somebody who is practicing a lot, and this is what they spend a huge part of their time practicing and working with. In terms of a whole community, I'd say this I don't know, there hasn't really been, I haven't come across many discussions as to how widespread napping ability was within Neolithic communities. I think there is an assumption that, I'd say there would be assumption that it was quite widespread, that most people would be able to kind of produce something, that it is they're exposed to kind of on a daily basis, or quite frequently. You do see it at a lot of in terms of Neolithic houses, either in the early Neolithic, so before the tombs and stuff, the early Neolithic house horizon, a lot of those structures have evidence of flint knapping taking place at them. When we come to kind of the middle Neolithic and later Neolithic, where we see kind of more pits and more ephemeral structures, again we're seeing lots of evidence of debitage taking place. It isn't taking place at one site or here and there. It seems to be quite widespread. So I'd say knowledge of it was kind of spread amongst quite a lot of people at a young age, and then as people got older, you would have had a general level of knowledge held across the community, with then a number of people developing into more specialist or high level production of tools.
Yeah, I really like that question. I like that answer. It's, as modern industrial societies, we're very much used to, like, childhood belongs over here, and then we send you to school for 12 years, and then you can do adult jobs. And really, that's not how traditional societies work at all. We're just back from northern Finland, where we had a great visit to a reindeer herder's family, and they showed us some slides of their year in review, and that from years 2 onwards, from actually being able to toddle around, they were involved in the herding of the reindeer, in the branding and marking of the reindeer for the herds, and it's something that you just absorb. You absorb through childhood before you perhaps become refined and specialist within the family, according to your own affinities and abilities. So we can see. I absolutely believe that you can see that within the archaeological record. And it's a good example. This question is a good example of how we need to get outside of our modern biases and worldview to kind of see it from a completely different way. So, yeah.
Excellent. And so we've got another question now from Anna that just came in following our discussion about obsidian and pitchstone. And she would like to know, how do you know the difference between pitchstone and obsidian?
For myself, in this case, I think it's more just a geographical distribution. I'm not a geologist, but my understanding would be obsidian. I don't think there's any sources within the British Isles, and I'm not sure about continental Europe. So pinchstone would be the kind of area, or the identification I would lean towards. I think there was another couple of pieces, or one piece found of similar material found at Newgrange or Douth, which in the paper it was called obsidian, but you would really need to go to a geologist and go down the level of specialist kind of analyses to identify positively whether it's pitchstone or obsidian. But I think just geographically, that just because I'm not aware of any obsidian sources, or I don't think there are any obsidian sources nearby, that it is pitchstone.
Speaking, I know you're not a geologist, you've just said, but there is another question actually from a member of our dig team who I feel like is trying to do his homework right now. Because what Jonathan would like to know is, what is the difference between chert and flint geologically? Do they come from different places? Is one harder to work with than the other? And I can say, as someone who's worked on this site, it's really the chert that comes on this site is much harder for me to tell between that and flint than on other sites where there's a bigger difference between the two. So what do you think about that?
So there's in terms of Irish archaeology, there's a very clear difference between flint and chert. Chert is a kind of black stone that comes from seams within limestone bedrock. It's more difficult to work. It has bedding planes within it, so you cannot control as easily the removal of those flakes and blades. Flint, on the other hand, comes from chalk bedrock. So if you go up north, up near the Giant's Causeway, if you go look at the chalk cliffs that are down by the sea, you'll see these bands of flint nodules running through the chalk. So they have different geological origins, and that affects how they form. Realistically, or once you go down to a much finer level, like molecular level, chert, flint, quartz, jasper, agate, chalcedony, they're all a variation of silica dioxide. So they're all essentially the same. It's just as they form, the crystals form slightly differently. And so that affects how well or how easily they can be worked. So they come from different geological zones and they form slightly different manners, but very similar rocks at the end of the day.
And Brendan, have you seen a big variation between chert and flint, a much bigger variation between chert and flint on other sites versus those in Ireland? Is it just me and my fellow team members that need to get our eyes in a little bit better?
Getting your eyes in is the thing. Context is everything, as we started out saying. So material changes before, as you move site to site, and the deposits change and everything. So getting your eyes in with the Irish material is really key. The geological sources of that material, once you start to see a lot of it, you can say, okay, well, that's likely to come from X, Y, or Z, is really important too. Because again, it puts you in mind of the people. The material didn't begin its life there. It was transported, it was traded, it was exchanged, or it was carried. Think, understanding the type of material, where it's likely to have come from, will add significantly to the story and make it mobile, rather than this static site of dots on a map.
So we have time for one final question, and it was again about sourcing, actually. If there is worked quartz at other Irish Neolithic sites, where does the quartz tend to come from? Is it common across the island, or with all of these sites having it come from specific quarries in different places?
Cian, do you want to take that again?
So I think it's quite common across the island. So you will find quartz within soil deposits across the island, and you'll also find it in seams. So Brendan mentioned the quartz seams in the sandstone. You will get them in granite kind of bedrocks as well. I've read one or two mentions of it occurring in limestone, but I've not actually seen that myself, or wouldn't have come across it all that often. So I'd say you probably have a distribution between some people are retrieving from the soil. Certainly with Neolithic, when they're we have the introduction of agriculture, so when they're ploughing soil or turning it over for crops, they could be exposing materials within the soil. Again, if they're constructing monuments and desodding around those monuments, they'll be exposing materials within the soil there. And then as they move through the landscape, they may come across seams of it within rock outcrops through there. I know Torben Ballin has identified a few quartz quarries in Scotland. There hasn't been a similar attempt in Ireland to identify possible quarries for quartz. So I would suggest soil, possibly some quarrying from bedrock seams as well.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting take. I think that there's a quality to the quartz that we're finding. Some of it's very clearly, frost shattered, or it's emerged from topsoil. Quartz can be found anywhere. Some of the really nice stuff, the rock crystal that still has some of its crystalline structure to it. I suspect that is seam mined. I suspect that's come from some distance. Lots of work still to do on that, and particularly finding parallels. But the other interesting story is that there was an assumption that some of these quartz artifacts kind of happen much later than when we're finding them. As a kind of a Bronze Age story to it, whereas ours is much earlier, the beginning of the Neolithic. So there are, one or two places where that's the case in Ireland. There's a significant number in Wales, but I think it's kind of changing the picture to some extent. But yeah, really interesting question, and lots to do on finding that source. But what a great story that would be if we could link up the actual source of where the material came from, and then how it ended up on our site. Save that for the analysis, eh?
Yeah, that would answer all these huge questions about mobility and resources and landscape use, and everything that's left for us to do. And we've only got 2 years. I couldn't resist. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So I want to finish actually by saying thank you so much for joining us today to explore some of our small but very mighty finds from Ireland's Point Valley. None of these DV discoveries that you have heard about today would have been possible without the support of our crowdfunders and our subscribers as well. So thank you to everyone listening who's a part of our team. If you'd like to get involved and help us find some of the answers to the questions that we've been talking about today, follow the links on your screen now, and you can help us make this year's dig possible by crowdfunding to join us in the trenches. And there are still actually a few places left, or support us from home. You can also become a subscriber to support our work all year round and check out our events calendar for other upcoming digs that you can either join on site or online. Read our blogs, watch more videos, dive into the range of archaeology courses that we've got, sign up to the newsletter, or follow us on social media for the latest dig updates. We are impossible not to find if you're looking for more archaeology. And thank you once again to our guest speaker, Kian, for taking the time to join us today, and for our site director, Brendan, to show up and say some more words about the site, which I know he loves to do. So thanks, people. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the audience next time. Have a great afternoon.
Okay, all the best. Bye.
Thanks very much.